Today, we're going to talk about evidence showing that seafaring goes back at least 130,000 years. This is over 10 times older than the oldest ship ever found. It's also over 60,000 years older than the earliest evidence for ships in the archaeological record. And it's so old that it predates even the last interglacial period, which was from about 130,000 to 115,000 years ago. So what could this evidence possibly be? It turns out that there are three major pieces of evidence that show people were sailing around 130,000 years ago. These pieces of evidence all come from the Persian Gulf, which today is one of the most treacherous places to sail due to its high winds and violent storms. The idea that our ancestors were sailing here 130,000 years ago is pretty mind-boggling, given how dangerous this area is today. But before we get into that, if you haven't already, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It really helps me out, and hopefully you'll learn something along the way. Anyway, the first piece of evidence comes from a site called Adakia, which is located on the Persian Gulf in Iraq. In 2018, researchers found flint tools here that had been previously eroded by seawater. Now, this is interesting on its own because the closest shoreline was about 80 kilometers away. To get these rocks to this site, they would have been transported by boat. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. At this same site, researchers also uncovered large quantities of marine shells, including those of scallops, mussels, and oysters. What's interesting about these shells is that they weren't native to the area. They actually came from much further south near the modern-day Strait of Hormuz. This strait is only about 33 kilometers wide, but it can be very dangerous to sail through because of the intense winds and large waves. The archaeologists who found these shells realized that the only way the shells could have gotten to Adakia was via boat. If they had been transported by any other method, such as being washed away by a flood, then the shells would have been crushed or broken. But these shells were in too good of a condition for that to have happened. Researchers calculated that the sediment in which these shells were buried dated to 128,000 years ago. However, newer research has shown that this date may be too young, and that the shells could be as old as 140,000 years. This means that people could have been sailing in the Persian Gulf during the last interglacial period, when global temperatures were up to 3 degrees higher than they are today. But wait, there's more. Also at the Adakia site, researchers discovered fish bones that showed clear-cut marks made by humans. This shows that people weren't just sailing around the Persian Gulf, they were actually fishing there as well. And not just any fish either. One of the species they caught was a type of tuna, which is still a prized catch today. Tuna typically prefer deeper, colder water and have never formed a school in the Persian Gulf. The only time they've been found here is when a storm or current brings them up from the deep ocean. This again points to our ancestors having sailed or navigated somehow into the Persian Gulf. The second piece of evidence that shows people were sailing 130,000 years ago comes from another site nearby called Shagaba. At this site, researchers uncovered several layers of sediment with marine microfossils, indicating that there was once a coastline here. The problem is that the closest coastline today is over 160 kilometers away. This couldn't have been caused by a flood because there are no signs of any other animal bones or plant remains which would have been washed away by water. Instead, this indicates that someone brought these shells here intentionally. Even though this site is 160 kilometers from the nearest sea today, it's only 70 kilometers from the shore during the last interglacial period. This means that our ancestors could have sailed from Bahrain to Shagaba, which would have been a relatively short trip for them. But what's even more interesting is that researchers found traces of birch pollen at the exact same site. Birch trees are native to Europe and don't grow naturally anywhere near the Persian Gulf. The fact that they found pollen here could mean that our ancestors traveled all the way from Europe to visit this site. This would have been an incredible voyage, especially given the rough waters of the Persian Gulf. In fact, even modern boats sometimes get damaged while sailing here. But there's yet another piece of evidence that pushes the timeline of seafaring back even further. over 14,000 years further. You see, at the Adakya site, researchers uncovered the remains of a small boat. The reason why they knew it was a boat is because of the type of wood that it was made from. See, wood normally decomposes quickly unless it's submerged in stagnant water like a swamp. But this wood had been preserved in a salty, well-oxygenated environment like the ocean. Normally, scientists can only identify the species of wood from these remains, but in this case, they were actually able to identify individual trees. They found that the ribs of the boat came from two separate patches of mangroves, which indicated that the boat had been assembled in a shipyard. This is the earliest direct evidence for boat building ever found, dating back to 145,000 years ago. This makes seafaring older than the last interglacial period. So what does this all mean? Well, it shows that seafaring was invented sometime before 145,000 years ago. And I think it's safe to say that it probably didn't happen all that long before this date either, since we have direct evidence from right around this time. This means that humans have been sailing for at least 10 times longer than the oldest ship in the archaeological record, which is around 14,000 years old. It also means that seafaring was invented independently multiple times because it definitely evolved in different regions. For example, we know that the Aboriginal Australians were sailing in watercraft as early as 40,000 years ago. So this wasn't some invention that spread around the world. Instead, humans in different parts of the world independently realized that they could use boats to travel across the water, hunt for food, and explore new areas. But who were these seafarers? Who were these ancient people who dared to venture out into the open ocean? Well, it's thought that they belonged to a group of archaic humans called Homo sapiens idaltu. Homo sapiens idaltu is an extinct species of archaic human that lived in what is now the Middle East. They were the predecessors of modern humans, and they existed from roughly 200,000 to 130,000 years ago. They were known for their large brains and advanced cognitive abilities, which allowed them to develop complex language, plan ahead, and cooperate in groups. Their seafaring skills would have helped them to survive in a variety of environments and would have played a major role in their success as a species. However, around 130,000 years ago, the Earth began to cool and the climate became drier. This made it harder for them to find food and water, which may have contributed to their eventual extinction. Fortunately, modern humans were able to inherit their seafaring skills and use them to thrive. So the next time you go sailing, take a moment to appreciate the long history of seafaring and the skills of our ancestors who first ventured out onto the open ocean. Who knows? Maybe you will even stumble upon some ancient artifacts that help us learn even more about these mysterious seafarers. Now you need to watch the oldest ship ever found, 5,500 years old. Or check out 12 unbelievable ancient Greek inventions.